Hi everyone, we're just going to spend a few minutes here talking about the American system of government. This lecture sort of is a companion to the state government lecture that's also in this week. So most people know that there's three major branches of government in the U.S. There's the executive branch, the legislative branch, and then the judicial branch. Most people have learned that there's some balance of power between the three branches. What some people don't realize is that there's sort of other balances or sort of checks on that power as well, and that's some of the ways that the federal government and the states take responsibility for certain things. So a little more on that in the next lecture. And then the way local or county authorities also take responsibility for certain things. So there's this sort of shared level of authority across levels of government, or the shared authority across levels of government, but there's also the fact that certain levels of government take responsibility for certain kinds of things. So let's talk about just advance the slide here. Let's talk about the three branches of government real quick. So the executive branch, obviously headed by the president. There's an advisory body to the president, and that's known as the cabinet. The president can appoint members of the cabinet. The president is also responsible for appointing members to the judiciary branch, which are then confirmed by members of the legislative branch. The executive is able to declare war, but is supposed to get consent from the Senate. That's changed over history as the U.S. government has realized that the president needs a little bit more sort of latitude to be able to act quickly to certain international situations and things like that. But what the executive branch is primarily responsible for is running the day-to-day operations of government. And so things like the IRS are sort of divisions of the executive branch. And that's sort of, collecting taxes is sort of an essential function of government. And that purview really falls under the president. So the legislative branch, which we'll talk more about here on the next slide, is really responsible for passing the laws. Obviously, the president signs them into law, but then the president is also responsible for administering those laws. Now, one of the ways that the executive branch in sort of the last 30 or 40 or 50 years or so has been able to sort of consolidate power is to, or I shouldn't say consolidate power, but exercise maybe a little bit more power, is that they can simply change levels of funding for an agency who would be responsible for administering some kind of law. So even though a law might have been passed, the president can sort of undermine that law by changing the funding levels of whatever agency that is responsible for administering the law. That these kinds of things are often done through an executive order or some kind of memo or something like that. And the president, while they can propose laws, that's usually that kind of thing happens when the same party that's in control of the White House is also in control of the legislative branch as well, because the responsibility of initiating legislation, formally initiating legislation, falls to the legislative branch. So the legislative branch passes all laws. It also passes the budget. So obviously, if there's no money, there are no programs. The laws might regulate industry, but they might also create new organizations inside of the executive branch that would be responsible for implementing the law. Now, the legislative branch in the U.S. government is a bicameral legislature. That means there's two houses, bicameral, two houses. And legislation can start in either house. Funding funding bills start with the Speaker of the House, but other forms of legislation can be initiated by either house. But what's ultimately got to happen is that both houses have to pass legislation. So there's often a reconciliation process where the Senate would sort of come to terms with whatever bill a House has passed, or vice versa, where the House might come to terms with whatever bill the Senate has passed. And then, assuming they're able to sort of agree on the changes, it's advanced to the president. So again, that's called the reconciliation process. So the judicial branch obviously is responsible for determining whether or not laws are constitutional. That happens through sort of many different levels of court systems, obviously federal, state, county courts. But there's many different levels of federal courts. There's even sort of court systems below the county system, town courts and things like that. The Supreme Court, probably the most noteworthy court in the land, or certainly the one that gets the most attention from the press. But for a case to actually get to the Supreme Court means that it's really wound its way through a very long system or a number of court systems. And so when a law is found unconstitutional, that means it's struck down. The Supreme Court typically hears cases twice a year, and then it issues opinions twice a year. And in the spring and in the fall, those are usually pretty newsworthy events. So state governments typically state governments were sort of formed in the vein of the federal government. So most state governments have similar three branches of government. All 50 states have some form of obviously have some form of state legislature. Only one state is not bicameral. We'll talk about that in the other lecture. Most states are not full-time legislatures. That means they have a sort of defined legislative session, and for a lot of states, that's sometime in January or February of each year. It's very rare for state government or for representatives in state legislatures to do this full time. Most have other jobs. And then local government, sort of they exist at the county, but then also the city level, the town level, the township level. Some states have boroughs. Pennsylvania's got a borough system. And then there's also a number of quasi-government authorities. So some power companies, some water companies. Typically, quasi-government authorities are organizations that sort of serve essential functions, but sort of exist in this public-private. They straddle this sort of public-private line. All right. Thanks for watching.